afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you're located. My name is Sarit Katan Gribbets, and I am an associate professor of Judaism in the theology department at Fordham University and the acting director of the Center for Jewish Studies this year. I want to welcome all of you virtually to our community, whether you're a regular at our events or if this is your first time, and to thank you for joining us today to hear a talk titled Learn Talmud Like an Artist by the amazing Jacqueline Nicholls. Before I introduce today's talk and speaker, I want to invite you all to our upcoming spring semester events. You can find more information and registration links on our blog and through our newsletter, and I will shortly place links into the chat so that you can access them easily through that as well. Our next event will take place next Wednesday, February 10th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when we'll be hosting Golan Moskowitz, who will be speaking about his new book, Maurice Sendak in Queer Jewish Context, in conversation with Naomi Seidman. A few years ago, I had the absolute pleasure of hearing Jacqueline Nicholls speak about her groundbreaking drawing project titled Daf Yomi, which she completed in January 2020. Daf Yomi is a practice of studying a page of Talmud a day. It takes 7.5 years to complete the study of one full cycle. Once only practiced in traditional communities, it is now popular across the Jewish world. Daf Yomi is Jacqueline's online project in which she drew the Talmud following the Daf Yomi schedule. I was immediately amazed when I first saw Jacqueline's work, not only by the art that she shared, but also by the ways in which she spoke about how she used her art as a way of studying the Talmud. I was in fact so inspired by Jacqueline's work that when it came time to imagining the cover of my recent book, I immediately thought of the very first drawing from Jacqueline's project, and Jacqueline was extremely generous in permitting me to feature her art on the cover of my book. And I should note that the very first comments I receive when someone sees my book for the first time is that the cover is beautiful. I'm sure she'll tell us more about the image and many others in her talk today. I have since seen Jacqueline's art featured elsewhere, including at the Jerusalem Biennale, and I couldn't be more excited to have the opportunity to learn from her today. Jacqueline is a London-based visual artist and Jewish educator. She uses her art to engage with traditional Jewish ideas in untraditional ways. Her art practice explores handwriting as a form of drawing. She coordinates arts and culture events at JW3 London and regularly teaches at the London School of Jewish Studies. Jacqueline's art has been exhibited in solo shows and significant contemporary Jewish art group shows in the UK, the US, Israel, and Poland. Jacqueline has an MA in Fine Art from Central St. Martin's, London. Jacqueline will speak for just under an hour, and then she'll answer questions. During and after her talk, please submit your questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And once Jacqueline finishes speaking, I will have the chance to ask her some of your questions. If we don't manage to ask and answer all of the questions, we'll be sure to share them with Jacqueline after the talk. So Jacqueline, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your work with us, and take it away.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much, Sarit, for inviting me and for that very warm introduction. It's lovely to be virtually with you. I hope you all are okay and that you're looking after yourselves and each other. I'm now going to share my screen and start my presentation. So let's just get that up. Yay, it works. Okay. Right. So here's a little bit of background about me and my approach to my art practice. So I'm an artist and also an educator of traditional Jewish texts, and I describe my art practice as this meeting of the art studio with the Bet Midrash. But it's the same space. I don't have an idea in my learning and then go into a studio to illustrate it. Rather, the act of drawing, the act of making is an act of thinking and learning. So I begin with a sort of scratch of an idea, a question, and through this meticulous making where my hands are busy, I start thinking, my mind starts thinking differently, and the artwork will reveal something new. Now, traditional Judaism has an ambiguous relationship with visual art and visual culture, but the visual is an incredibly important part of Jewish culture. And it's something that I've used throughout my work. And here are some little thumbnails of like various projects of mine. And you can see that I use different techniques: embroidery, drawing, painting, paper cuts. But throughout there, the text is always there, and it's always in my handwriting, because this engagement with the text is not the text as religious authority, but rather artistic inspiration. So I put it in my handwriting as a way of taking ownership of the text as it shifts from this authoritative page to this intimate space on my notebooks and in my artwork. And the text is mediated in my handwriting through my body, and it engages with materials, and it leaves a thought trace. So let's go to Daf Yomi, the Draw Yomi. What on earth made me kind of want to learn the Talmud every day and draw it? To be honest, it started, the idea came to me on a Shabbat lunch after too much wine. We'll get to the problems of wine later, but I just really wanted to know what was in the Talmud, what was in this book, this behemoth of a text that is held so dear, that forms the foundation of rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism that we have today, that we are today. And yet it contains so much that is difficult and problematic to learn, especially as a woman. Growing up, it wasn't taught to me. I'm from a fairly traditional Orthodox background, family. It wasn't expressly forbidden, but neither was it expected of me to learn this, unlike my brother with whom it was. I just wanted to know, I wanted to know what was in this precious text. And in order for me to learn it and think about it and understand it, I need to have a pencil or a pen or a scalpel or a brush in my hand. I needed to draw it. And I also set it up publicly. This is a page from my blog. I had a blog, Draw Yomi. And that was a way of like committing publicly to doing this. And I wanted also to be part of the global conversation around Daf Yomi. And that global conversation is the original vision of Daf Yomi from Rabbi Meir Shapiro back in 1923. And I'm going to read a quote of his, and I think it's really beautiful how he saw Daf Yomi. And he said, "What a great thing. A Jew travels by boat and takes Gemara Brachot, the first tractate in the Talmud, under his arm," and it is a he in his mind. When he arrives in America, he enters a Beis Midrash in New York and finds Jews learning the very same daf that he studied on that day. And he gladly joins them. Another Jew leaves the States and travels to Brazil or Japan. And he first goes to the Beis Midrash, and there he finds everyone learning the same daf that he himself had learned that day. Could there be a greater unity of hearts than this? And it really is this. And today, I mean, we're now on the 14th cycle of Daf Yomi. And if you go on Twitter, hashtag Daf Yomi, you will see being played out this global conversation. I don't think Rabbi Shapiro had any kind of inkling of what Twitter or anything could be like, but it really is fulfilling his global, his vision of this global Jewish conversation. So this is the first page. This is actually the artwork that Sarit kindly chose for to grace the front of her book. And the Talmud begins with a question. When does the night begin? When is it time to say the evening Shema, the evening Shema prayer? And it answers this question with another question, which is, well, when's dinner? When's the evening meal? Because that determines when is nighttime. And when is the evening meal is determined on who's eating. And there's three answers given on this page. Like, is it the priests doing the Marav sacrifices, the leftover sacrifices from the end of the day? The day has gone, it's now nighttime, and the priests offer these leftover sacrifices, of which they will have some. So are the priests having their supper? And there's another opinion that says, like, look at the poor people. because the poor people will come in from the fields. They're not going to use too much fuel to light their homes as well as cook their food. So when the poor people are eating their supper, that is nighttime. That's the beginning of nighttime. And there's another opinion that says, like, look at when your friends, when are regular people having their meal? Like, don't look at the kind of the priests or the kind of the basic, the poor, but look at just what your friends are doing. And I think it's sort of asking a different question of, like, who influences us? How do we structure our sense of time? Do we follow leaders? Do we think about basic necessities, or are we influenced kind of peer pressure from our society group around us? And then there's a fourth explanation. There's a fourth idea of when does nighttime begin, which is not reliant on following other people, but rather go outside and directly engage with the world. Look up in the skies and look for 3 stars. That is night. Have your own relationship with the world. And so I was kind of doing this drawing. And at the beginning, it was like, I'm not entirely sure what I was doing with this. I was waiting for the drawing to reveal it. And I was so I have the knife and fork and the leftover, there's crumbs. We have the 3 stars in this drawing, but we also have this figure of somebody saying the Shema Prayer, the prayer that we normally say with our eyes covered. Now, if you're drawing yourself saying the Shema, you're going to take little sneaky peeks in the mirror to see what you look like. And it was, as I was doing this drawing, it kind of clicked for me what this project was about. And that is, I wanted to be open-eyed. I didn't want to cover my eyes anymore when I consider my engagement with the text, my engagement with God. I wanted to be open-eyed, open to the text, open-minded to my own prejudice, but open. And it was like this image of this, like, actually I'm looking, my eye is fully open there. So I'm going to share with you a selection of these. I mean, there's 2,711 drawings, so I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to show a section, but hopefully we'll weave a path that shows my evolving approach to this artistic engagement with the Talmud and how I use my drawings to think, but also to reply, to speak back to the page. So let's start with Brachot, first tractate. Let's start with this page. This is Brachot 6. And on this page, it describes that we are surrounded by demons. And there's a lot of demons in Brachot. And these Talmudic discussions took place in Babel, and you can see traces of their surrounding culture, of Zoroastrianism, of the Babylonian culture. And you definitely find it when they talk about demons. Anyway, so we have here demons. And we have 10,000 demons on one side of us and 1,000 demons on the other side of us as we go through the world. So we've got to be very careful because we're vulnerable, and we're especially vulnerable entering derelict buildings. Don't go there on your own. You kind of think they're probably unsafe anyway. The demons will get you. And to find out that you really are surrounded by demons, or if you are surrounded by demons, there's a simple test which they talk about on this page, which is if you just put dust around your bed at night, and if when you wake up in the morning, you see bird footprints, then you know, haha, there were demons. So be careful. And so this drawing shows the bird footprint in the bottom there, but it also shows this lonely, solitary female figure surrounded by the demons, because the demons will only attack you when you're considered alone. And so it gives examples of being in company, be in a kind of a minyan, so don't pray in a synagogue with others. There's safety in numbers. That doesn't apply today in the pandemic. There's a kind of being a chevruta, being a learning pair, and there's other examples, but all those examples in the Talmud's time were ones which women were not included in that count. So I kind of had this question of, like, well, are women always then considered alone and vulnerable? Where's her protection? Where's her kind of safety from being surrounded by demons? So that was the question I had on page 6. Turn the page 7. We're no longer talking about demons, but we are talking about vulnerability, and it's talking about God. And here God is described as getting angry with the people, but then God looks into the tefillin, into the scrolls that are in God is wearing in his tefillin. And God remembers to be compassionate and love the people, and then calms down. It's very anthropomorphic, and it's very much God as he is being described there. The rabbis ask, well, how long does God's anger last? I mean, you know, if God's going to be angry with you, is that a long time? You get the sense that maybe the rabbis anger kind of a bit worried that they anger God a bit too much. And they answer as well, it's the time it takes for the cockerel's red bit to flash white and then back to red, but also to stand on one leg. And then I kind of woke up a bit and sort of thought that, and it's like, here we have the same visual image for God's anger, the birds on one leg, the footprint, as you do the day before about the presence of demons. So I made this link between the two, and I have this sort of shadowy figure, which is all this. By the way, I kind of ended up developing this kind of visual shorthand. So this kind of weird creature there became my shorthand for demons. And so I made this think about these two ways of thinking about threats and danger. Is it demons that we need to be protected and ward against? Or do we, when we're feeling vulnerable, we need to consider our relationship with God? Like what does it mean to feel vulnerable? So I made these connections between two pages, but I also sometimes make connections on the same page. The Talmud's layout and pagination in terms of what bits of text were kind of on the same page, that was kind of done by, it was really sort of established in the early 16th century by the Venetian printing house under the Daniel Bomberg with the kind of Jewish advisors, but it was there. And it's been that way for this time. And that's plenty to kind of create a unit to play in. And this is Shabbat 139. Now, on this page, they're asking about vineyards. They're asking a question about vineyards, but they're not sure of the answer. And that prompts a whole foretelling of the future, where at some point the Torah will be forgotten completely. Woe to us that Torah was forgotten, etc. And then they go into a bit of a blame game about whose fault it is that Torah will be forgotten. And they blame the judges who don't know how to give correct decisions. They also blame the scribes in the court for not writing things down properly. And they also, you see, by the way, I kind of had developed the shorthand of the three chairs to be judges, or chairs to be judges, the sitting judges. And so here you have these three figures sitting on chairs, which are the three judges, and behind them you've got these three shadowy figures who are kind of whispering, hovering, because also they blame the rabbis for not teaching the judges properly, for not instructing them properly. And this is a corrupt society where things are forgotten, everything's broken down, everything has declined. And so that finished, and actually that discussion in the Talmud finished, and then it started a new Mishnah, a new section of the Oral Torah, which the Gemara are conversations about. And that new Mishnah is a completely new subject, but it's on the same page. It happens to be on the same page. And this is a conversation about your Shabbat lunch, and you're drinking lots of wine, like I was when I came up with the idea to do JW3 Yomi. And you want to open a new barrel of wine. We don't serve that much wine. But how do you then open a barrel and serve the wine? Because it needs a bit of filtering process. There's dregs. So and you shouldn't really filter on Shabbat. So the Mishnah asks, how do you open a new barrel of wine on Shabbat and filter the dregs out? And this is where I made a link between the degradation of society's knowledge and standing and filtering the dregs, and everything has a capacity to crumble, and there will be sediment, and that will needs to be, and those dregs need to be dealt with. So I'm making a kind of artistic, a poetic connection, if you like, between one bit of Talmud and another bit of Talmud that happen to be on the same page, and yet I see a kind of thematic way of linking the two. Now, sometimes I brought in my own contemporary reality to the page. Here is Eruvin 82. Now, Eruvin is building, it's a tractate discussing the Eruv, this boundary that one is not allowed to carry on Shabbat in a public space. And so the Eruv is a device in which public space becomes shared semi-private space, within which there's sort of shared ownership and shared property, and therefore you can carry between one and the other. And it also is discussing other aspects to do with boundaries and Shabbat. So here it's discussing how, on this page, it's discussing how far one can walk on Shabbat, because one can only walk a certain distance. There's a limit, it's called the Techum. And it asks that for children, do they consider that they belong to their father, so their father's boundary, or do they belong to their mother and their mother's boundary? And it's answered, well, the children are considered their mothers until they no longer need their mother. And when does a child no longer need their mother? It's when a child cries out for their mother in the night, but then can settle themselves and go back to sleep. So when the child can self-soothe, they no longer need their mother. And this struck me as a mother as a bit absurd, because actually babies can do that fairly young, but that doesn't mean that they don't need you anymore. And they're independent. And so I was kind of pondering this, and then later that same day, I was on the tube, I was on the kind of in the underground on the train, and I saw these two sitting there, kind of opposite me, and it was a half-term shopping trip for teenage daughter and mum. They looked similar, but it was very much like, this is definitely mum and daughter, and they had shopping bags and things around them, and the daughter closed her eyes. And I'll read my notes. And I said, they were sitting opposite me on the tube. It was half-term shopping trip for teenage daughter and mum. She closed her eyes and fitted herself around her mother's body and held on. Every so often, she took a sip from her mother's water bottle. Neither said a word to each other the whole journey. It seemed that they didn't need to. Why do they ask at what age is a child who does not need their mother? There seems to be no age limit, no techum, no boundary. Now, other times, that was a very figurative kind of engagement with the way I treated the text there. And other times I became quite abstract in how I tackled the page. Now, this is from Chulin. Chulin is a tractate that deals with the slaughter of animals. It's in, and much of today's practical Jewish law about kosher meat comes from this tractate. It's one of the key tractates that for to become a rabbi. And when my husband, who is he's an Orthodox rabbi, and he was going through his rabbinic training, he was learning this practically off by heart. I mean, he knew this so well. He wasn't the most interesting person to talk to at that time, because he kept kind of remembering bits of it. But anyway, but it is a much learnt, much remembered text. And so for this, I decided to transcribe the whole tractate, well, each page in my handwriting. So you see there that I've written out in my handwriting the tractate as a kind of embodying the text and to learn it by writing it. And I use this red-brown ink, this sort of reminiscent of blood. And then I played with the text. I kind of used water and I played and disrupted the text to form an image. And I directed it somewhat, but I also allowed this kind of accidental markings to do their thing. Now, this page in particular is about the requirement to cut through in slaughtering. They've got two tubes. So you've got the windpipe and you've got the esophagus, and the importance to cut through both of those tubes when slaughtering, and to also to separate them. So that is this page. So you kind of see I have to go from quite representational to quite abstract. And I was heavily influenced by the medium I chose for that Masechet, because I was using a different medium, a different drawing material for each section to give its own character. Now, this is shkalim. Shkalim is about the half shekel that was collected for the temple. It was kind of for communal sacrifices and for maintenance. It was a kind of tax. And this one I decided to do out of collage, just because I didn't have a particular conceptual reason why to do it. I just fancied doing collage. Now, on this page, it talks about there are 13 gates in the temple to Jerusalem. There's the temple in Jerusalem, including one gate called the Water Gate. And there, a trickle of water will emerge out of that gate. But as it goes down the hill and enters Jerusalem, it gets bigger and bigger, and then it sort of describes out almost taking over the whole world. It's this like tiny bit of water then gets bigger and bigger. Also on this page, it has a story of the impending destruction of the first temple, and it tells the story of the king, knowing that this was coming, went up to the roof of the temple and took the temple key and threw it up to heaven, where a hand came out from heaven and caught it. And I was kind of really struck by this idea of, like, we've just had a description of 13 gates, but there's only one key. What does that mean? There's one key for the, like, what gate needs to be locked? So I was that was what I was thinking about when I began to make this. But because I was doing it as collage, what was I going to use for the temple gate? Now you can see my answer here, but I was kind of thinking, if I was doing it in ink or I was doing it in pencil, I would have drawn just abstract idea of doors. I would have done a kind of very kind of simple idea of a door, but this is collage. And then as you can see, the answer was right there in front of me in the Gemara, because the printing convention became that of traditional Jewish texts. It's like from the Italians, that the title page is a gateway page. It's a portico. And that's what I used. I used 13 of these title pages, these porticos. We no longer have the temple as our place to meet God. Instead, we have the Talmud. So we open our books and we enter. And like the water gate, the Talmud may contain a phrase a little bit from the Tanakh, but the conversations, the debates, and the understandings get bigger and bigger and expand it outwards. And so I kind of brought all this here in this drawing. But I also want to stay with this image and talk about the key, because this is like, because it was collage, I also had that dilemma. Well, what key was I going to use to be the key of the temple that gets thrown up to heaven? I couldn't just draw a kind of icon, like I could just draw a kind of abstraction of a version of a key. It was like a collage one. And this is actually it was actually picked up by somebody on Twitter who about tweeting about this event. So I went, my goodness, isn't that the key to hell? Neil Gaiman's Sandman. I'm a huge Sandman fan, and it is in fact, yes, the key to hell. And I'm not going to go into why the key to hell in the Sandman story is there. It's a brilliant story, and Neil Gaiman is brilliant at kind of bringing and weaving mythology in the storytelling. But I wanted to use this key to hell. I mean, it is a bit controversial maybe to say the key to the temple is the key to hell, but not really. So I just bear with me on this. So in the Jewish tradition, hell, Gehenna, wasn't it's understood, and it's kind of mentioned in a few times in the Gemara, that this isn't a permanent place of suffering. People are like the souls in hell are only like there for 11 months. They're not even there a full year, and it is a place of temporary place of repentance before the soul then ascends to heaven. And the role that the temple has is a place for the person, for the soul within the living body, to go and repent to repent of one's sins and to be and live with God. But it also goes a bit further than that. One of the things I love about learning Talmud and I loved about Daf Yomi, is that it's finding out that stuff is a lot more complex and sometimes the opposite of the Judaism that you're taught as a child. Because the temple itself is always put up as a spiritually pure place, built by King Solomon because his father David was too violent, too bloodshedding, killed too many people, and so Solomon built it, and no iron can be used to cut the stones. They used this miraculous shamir worm to cut the stones. Such a pure place. But we have a story in Gittin about this, how Solomon gets hold of the shamir worm. And it's a long, shaggy dog of a story that involves violence and rape and incest and suicide and theft and much trickery and riddles. And Solomon kidnapping the king of the demons, Ashmedai, who, when you learn that story, you are rooting for Ashmedai. You're rooting for the king of the demons. He's definitely the hero. It's one of my favorite bonkers story in the Talmud. And I think it's the Talmudic rabbis having a bit of a laugh at this idea of the purity of the temple, because the temple was violent. It was hierarchical. There was power manipulation. It was dangerous, and so much blood. And if you're a woman whose husband was jealous, it was hell. This drawing is from Sota. This is the tractate Sota, which talks about the Sota Ritual, where a wife who's accused of adultery is brought to the temple by her husband, and there's a kind of humiliation process, and she's tried, testing her innocence by drinking bitter waters. If she's innocent, she lives. If she's guilty, her body explodes in a very grotesque fashion. And this tractate, what I did for this one is I actually photocopied the Talmud page, and then using a very kind of thick black pen, I kind of drew on it and then kind of blocked out the text, sort of erased the text, echoing the ritual itself, where the Torah text is dissolved in the water, making it bitter. Torah should be sweet, not bitter. And I want to erase this area of law, or at least put women into the text. It's part of the conversation, and raise my voice in objection to this ritual as part of our tradition. And it is important to have one's voice in the conversation. And I often use the layout of the Talmud. So you have here the layout, the actual Talmud page, you see there with the central block of text with the commentaries around that. That was the layout that was established in Venice. I mean, it was a bit in the earlier version as well, but in Venice and Bombo, but there's also in the Vilna Shas, they take the same layout. And this layout of the central block of text with the commentary is something that I came back to as a visual in the drawing, and reflected on the experience of the Talmud as an object, a visual object and container of the laws and stories. This is from Horiot. Horiot is a kind of small tractate, and it deals with the politics of rabbinic authority, and it's fascinating. And I did this with a mixture of drawing, and also the red is actually embroidery. This is a kind of mixture of embroidery and drawing on this page. Now, this story on this page is this kind of question, this subversion of authority. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is the head of and he's challenged by Rabbi Meir. And Rabban Gamliel is then tipped off that Rabbi Meir is going to challenge him, and there'll be a showdown because Rabbi Meir is going to kind of ask him about a rather obscure part of halacha, and he's sort of tipped off about it, and so he comes and he's prepared. But then he realizes there's a potential coup, and Rabban Gamliel then removes Rabbi Meir from the Bet Midrash. He expels him. And so then describes that Rabbi Meir is sitting outside the Bet Midrash, and he can hear the conversations, but he passes notes through. I kind of imagine sort of throwing notes over the wall or in the window. And the students inside the Bet Midrash miss Rabbi Meir, miss his voice, and miss his Torah, miss his insights. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel allows his voice and his opinions to be part of the discussion, but only if it's anonymous. It's not enough, and that's the punishment. Yes, you can have an opinion, but your name is not part of the conversation. And I take this, it's not enough just to have a voice. You need to have a name. You need to have a full presence in this, fully participant in the conversation. Now, my thinking would often evolve as I was going through the Masechet, and I want to show this example here. This is from Kidoshim, and on the left is the first page, and then on the right is the second. I decided to use dip pen and red ink, this very beautiful red ink, and I was feeling out my approach. Now, Kidoshim is about marriage, specifically how to acquire a wife, how to buy a wife. Is it like buying a field, or is it like buying a slave? Is a wife movable property or immovable property? And so I kind of so there we have the reclining woman above the word Isha. I always kind of, with the first page of each tractate, kind of highlighted the word that was highlighted in the graphic thing. And here you have a woman, this female form that her body is like the hills of landscape there. But by the second, actually, the style kind of shifted, and it kind of became the fix of what it was going to be on the right. And then you see here, I actually kind of did a banknote. So sort of it says here, pay the father. And I did this whole section of Kiddushin as subversive banknote art. And also in this, and here we have another example. So here we have on this one, and this is on page 5, talks about 3 ways in which to marry. So you can have a document, you have money, you have sex, and then where does the chuppah? So you have the kind of the triangle, and where does the chuppah fit in? So, and then she is to not say anything. There should be no talking, just silent and receiving. So there you have a banknote, and in the kind of, it has the phrase Harayat Mekadeshet Li, which is the phrase that is used in the marriage ceremony. So it's kind of this relationship, this kind of antagonistic relationship that I kind of, this difficult relationship I have with the text, kind of as a woman, but also as an artist. And I found this page, and I found this very interesting, and it kind of gave me a lot of direction and inspiration about this relationship between artists and rabbis. So this is from Kidoshim 33, and it describes the artisans, the crafts, the artisans in Jerusalem. And it describes how that the artisans don't stand up to give honor to the rabbis and scholars because it distracts them from their work and their livelihood. But when the farmers come to Jerusalem to offer the first fruits, the artisans do stop their working and they do stand up to give them honor. And they're showing respect to the others who work with their hands and the land and the physical stuff of life. And I take from this of like, when I'm engaged in my art and when I am mindful of what I am doing, I do not need to show blind deference to the rabbis. I just need to get on with it. And I'm aware of the irony of kind of taking a piece of kind of rabbinic text to kind of say, don't like what that kind of relationship is to be. So I hope you've kind of appreciated that. You can see with the different examples I've shown you a few different drawing mediums, and each one was done in a different drawing medium to give its own personality, its own kind of identity, but it also kind of helped me as an aid memoir that I would sometimes come across my learning and go, oh yes, I remember I learned that story, that mad story about King Solomon and the demons, and I remember my drawing, oh, it was in kind of black and white on brown paper. It's from Pesachim, like, and then I could find the text. So this is some thumbnails from Seder Moed. The first kind of the tractates are bundled up into kind of different volumes, I suppose, it's a Seder. And the Seder Moed is about time. So here you find sections on the festivals, on Pesachim, Pesach, Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, Yom Kippur, etc. This is all here in Moed. And here we have a thumbnail of each of my, for one example of each page, so you can see the variety of the different drawing mediums I'm using. The next section, Seder Nashim. These drawings are sparser. This one's about women, but actually rather specific. It's actually about getting a wife, getting married, having a wife, and then divorcing a wife. And the sort of some of the complications that happen when you have a wife and you're so this is Seder Nashim, and my drawings definitely got pared down in this. Next came Nazikin, damages, and this is the sort of civil society stuff, like what are our responsibilities that we have to each other? How do we build a society that regulates this? And what are our structures of authority? What are the courts and the punishment systems? So this is all here in Nazikin, in damages. The next section is Kidoshim, which is purity. Kidoshim, sorry, holiness. And this is the holy stuff of the temple. The various sacrifices are all covered here in great detail, in a lot of detail. And it's really interesting to note that the Talmud is edited and compiled in Babylon years and years after the last sacrifice was offered in the temple. It's not in living memory, and yet these recorded conversations were not dropped. This is in contrast to the agricultural Mishnayot, the agricultural oral law, that we don't have the Talmud, we don't have the kind of Talmudic discussions on those Mishnayot. So here we have like the sense of like the temple may have gone, but either it might return, but more than that, learning the rituals replaces the performance. But there's something like there's no longer that physicality to our spirituality. And you get that sense in Kidoshim that there is something, they're describing a whole other world. And then the last section in the Talmud, Seder Taharot, purity. And this is ritual purity that's only really relevant for the temple. Who is pure is able to offer a sacrifice, or who is impure needs to stay away. Funnily enough, the only tractate, the only Masechet that we have the Talmudic, in the Babylonian Talmud that we have the discussions of is Nida. That is the when a woman is impure due to her menstrual cycle, and she needs to go through a purification ritual. This is really opening a whole other can of worms. Now, for this tractate, for this Masechet, I use the white squares of cotton, very similar to sort of squares of cotton that a woman would use to check her body if she is still bleeding, or if she's no longer bleeding and she can count 7 days where she's no longer bleeding, then goes to the mikveh to go to the purification water. So I use these white squares and also red acrylic paint. And I also wrote on this page, and you can see here in the detail on the right, I wrote down a list in pencil, all the names of the male rabbis who have a lot to say, who are speaking on the page, and have a lot to say about these women's bodies. And I kind of joked at the beginning of like, oh, and when the women's voices come in, I'll write them in differently. And actually, there were women who have speaking roles in this tractate. There are 4 women in total throughout the whole of the tractate. And when they came up, I wrote their names in kind of white pen on the kind of gauzy fabric. And this is a kind of nod to Helene Cizou's feminine writing, this writing in white ink. So this section, the last in the Daf Yomi cycle, this is actually the last page. And on the left, you can see how I work. So when I learned the page, I would make pencil notes on the left-hand side, sort of notes of my learning, sort of summing up kind of what was on the page. And then on the right-hand side would be my response, would be my drawing. And I realized I often wasn't drawing and focusing on I wasn't focusing so much what was on the page, but also what wasn't. And especially like who wasn't speaking, what questions haven't been asked, what's missing, what else is going on here, like what connections could be made, that kind of how are things drawn together. I wasn't interested so much in using my drawings to explain the text or illustrate it to others, but rather kind of to bring my voice into it and to have almost that conversation between the 2 halves of the notebook. And so this is, so it's kind of, so with Nidda, it's like, so sort of thinking about like what perspectives haven't been shown, what isn't there. And it's sort of like, they're sort of discussing kind of what status of purity does a woman in childbirth have. And also there was and then also on the right-hand side is they're discussing if a woman is bleeding throughout her pregnancy, is she impure or not impure? And I kind of felt very much like, well, if a woman is bleeding throughout her pregnancy, she might have other concerns. Is she's pure or not? She might have other concerns about that. And maybe she's not really thinking about that. But that is very much their concerns. It might not be her concerns during this vulnerable time. I don't want to give you the wrong idea, though, that it was these sexist rabbis. There was a lot of good stuff there too, and I did really enjoy it. There's some wild, amazing stories about demon kings and talking animals and giants and witches, and lots and lots of kind of dry legal hair splitting arguments. And building the patterns and associations. And Daf Yomi is a cycle. And so here we have at the beginning and the end, the first page with the last page. Now the Talmud ends with discussing women counting days of bleeding and not bleeding. Bleeding is part of her menstrual cycle and bleeding close to the cycle, and makes it, and also questions like when the difference between bleeding during the day and bleeding at night, and when is night. And it echoes actually for me the question that the Talmud begins with, which is, when does the night begin? Has everyone eaten? Are they back from the party? Are the stars out? And so some need to know it's nighttime to say the Shema, and others need to know it's nighttime because they're monitoring their internal body cycles. And both are nuanced everyday awarenesses of the body and time. And nighttime is a time of darkness where things are hidden and nothing is clear. And in Brachot, in Masechet Brachot, there's a discussion where it describes King David waking up in the middle of the night, actually on midnight itself, and writing the Psalms, writing Tehillim. But the Talmud, like, how did he know it was midnight? Because in the middle of the night, there are no observable natural phenomenon. Now, David, and it then describes that David had a miraculous wind that blew through his window and strummed his harp. But we're in the dark when we're learning the Talmud. We have no miraculous wind that blows through the system. We have our minds. The Talmud is this fragmented text. It's not structured text like a book with an arc of a beginning and a middle and an end. It has much missing, and reading it, one is aware of these black holes, these lacunas. Sometimes it feels that we're listening in from the room next door. We're only catching some of the voices. So in this fragmented, dark place with our minds, we try to bring light and clarity and definition and understanding. On the last line of the Talmud, it says that those who learn every day are those who are moving God's ways in the world and merit to walk into the next. Now, at the end of a completion of a significant chunk of learning, it's traditional to say Hadran, the Hadran prayer. And it begins with this paragraph, which I found incredibly beautiful and slightly puzzling as well. It says, we will return to you and you'll return to us. Our mind is on you and your mind is on us. We will not forget you and you will not forget us, not in this world, not in the next world. It's a dynamic relationship that we are having with the Talmud, but also the Talmud is having with us. It changes us and we change that and we change it. And these like last couple of images. So this was from at the end of the Daf Yomi cycle, and I do feel I very much was changed by this encounter, this engagement with the Talmud. And I had this event, the siyum of conclusion of the learning, and so I did this event on the 7th of January at JW3. And we curated the notebooks. There was one notebook from each Masechet around the room, and that was exhibited for public to come and consider. And then I had a structured conversation with invited scholars to explore different questions around about the Talmud's role in relationship to Jewish life and culture, its relevance to contemporary Jewish thought, with a range of different people. And it was really fascinating to see it all come together. It was fascinating for me to, like, I kind of hadn't sort of understood what it means to bring all this together before. And at the culmination of the event, I recited the Kaddish, the specific prayer that marks the end of this doing a significant piece of learning, and it was a sort of celebration. But I kind of realized as I was kind of working and planning the siyum, my thoughts of the Talmud, and I repeat what I said before, it's like the Talmud really felt it's not a book. It doesn't have an arc. There's no beginning, middle, or end. It seems you've read the whole thing before you've opened the first page. There are so many anomalies in the structure that describe it as a book makes no sense of what is a book. It's a collection of fragments and with absence, but it's not empty. This is a piece of artwork called, this is a piece of my artwork, which is a kind of no ink etching, which is taking this, it's like this empty space, this absent space in the middle is not empty. the conversation is missing many voices, but it is not an empty space. It's a humming, dynamic space of potential that invites us in to engage. So this recent work, it takes on the layout of a Talmud page. The Talmud is a book of absences. It's our legacy, and it's also an invitation. So thank you very much for listening. I have realized I've zoomed through all of this, and I'm very happy to hear any questions or comments that you have on this work. Thank you. Shall I stop sharing the screen or leave this image up, Sarit?
Why don't you stop the share, and then we can share the screen if you want to zoom in for anything else. Thank you so much for that amazing, really amazing walk through your project. And I want to start by saying that many people have already submitted questions, and I welcome everybody to submit questions, but the overwhelming sentiment is that this is an amazing project. And the two most frequent questions are, is this being recorded for people who came late? And that question is yes, so not to worry. And the second, which I had planned on asking you at the end, but so many people are asking, is before we dive into the project itself, what are you doing now that you finished the cycle? And are you planning on publishing these images in a book, or what is the next stage in the life of this project?
So the next stage in the life of this project is, so I am hoping to publish it as a book. I was working with somebody about it, but we had to take a bit of a break on that because they had their real life and COVID and stuff came up. So we've kind of taken a pause on that. It's kind of, it's weird because it's a lot of drawings and I have a lot to say on each one. So it's kind of very much thinking about, or if it is going to be published as a book, it's a lot of drawings to go into a book, but I am working with somebody about that, but there isn't anything, there's a potential book project there. I do have a website, the website that I use to blog, the drawyomi.blogspot, that is still there. Not all the pages are there actually. I think halfway through Nazikin, I suddenly got a bit like, look, I'm learning the page every day. I'm doing a drawing every day. To upload it and then post about it every day, that's just going to be one step too many. And I sometimes, so I kind of need, there are a few gaps where I need to kind of upload that drawing. So the gaps are kind of more about where it is on in terms of its presence online. I also, like, halfway through this, Instagram was launched, and actually I found it much easier to post my drawings on Instagram than I did on my blog. So definitely with the later drawings, they're pretty much, most of them are on Instagram. So it's really kind of, I need to tidy up that website and do that. But you know, at the moment, all the kind of the notebooks are there in my studio, and I go back and actually I kind of, when I'm not doing Daf Yomi in the same way as I did then, but I am kind of reviewing the page and reviewing the drawing. It's a bit frustrating because I don't really want to do a second drawing on each page, but it's quite hard to kind of look at what I did draw and go, oh, would I interpret it like that again? I don't know. So it's anyway, yeah.
So a few questions that we have are based on your process. The first is, which version of the Talmud did you use when you studied? Did you mentioned in your conversation, you know, in your remarks, the Vilna Shas, did you use Sefaria? Did your method of actual study change over the course of the 7.5 years?
So I was prompted, and you can see behind me on the bookshelves, I'm going to point there. So I was prompted, I sort of mentioned about that I had the Shabbat lunch and lots of wine and went, I'm going to do Daf Yomi and draw it, because the Koren Talmud with Rav Steinsaltz's commentary was coming out, and we had, my husband was given a kind of early, like a pre-whatever version of it. to look through, and I was looking through, and it was gorgeous and it's amazing, and Rav Steinsaltz's commentary is fantastic. And I was looking through it that Shabbat, and I was like, and I was kind of, and I've done drawing a day projects. I've been doing that for the Omer, sort of counting that time between Pesach and Shavuot, where you count 7 weeks every day. And I've been doing that as a drawing project for a couple of years. So I kind of was in that mode of this. And so I kind of had that. And so when these Talmuds were coming out, when the Koren was bringing out the Steinsaltz commentary, that was kind of my prompt to do it. And we collected them as they came out each time. So I would sit and learn the page and look at Steinsaltz's commentary, which was it's a really beautiful volume. Like, you have in one half, you have like the traditional pages, and then the other back you have it's translated into English with his commentary interposed. And so most of the days I just sort of sat and read the text, and some days when I didn't have time to really go through it, I would just look at the English translation, but then I kind of would jump to it and backwards from that way. I decided I did try out a few podcasts, and they weren't podcasts back then, but I did try out some kind of online shirim and things, and they weren't for me. And I also had, there's a really amazing Talmud teacher in London called Rabbi Michael Pollock, who has been teaching Daf Yomi for years, and he did a class. He teaches Daf Yomi, but he was doing a class where he was doing once a week a kind of summary of the last 7 days. And I used to go to that, and there was a wonderful kind of buzz and excitement when he started. And it was a really mixed group. And then I can't remember what, there was like, it got to one bit where it was like there were 3 of us left. And it was, and I felt that I wanted to have my own direct engagement with the text. Where you listen to a class from somebody else, you're hearing their interpretation, their summary, what they thought was important. And that's fascinating and that's great. But I think it's a real invitation to kind of have your own direct engagement with this text if you're going to invest in this time to do it like that.
The fact that only 3 of you were left in that class leads me to the next question, which is, did you actually create one work of art each day? Did you do it with a Daf Yomi schedule? How did you manage such a demanding project, not only practically demanding, but how did you find the inspiration every day to do something? And finally, what happened when you fell behind? Did you fall behind? How did you deal with that? So all of those questions about the daily aspect.
Yeah, pretty much I did it every day. I ran into trouble 3-day yontas. So I don't draw on Shabbat or on Yontif, and I live in London. And sometimes if you have like Rosh Hashanah or whatever, you have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you have 3 days. So that would just kind of send me in a bit of a spin, because then afterwards I had to catch up. And then with the catching up, and also if I was traveling, it sometimes kind of caught me. But I'm quite tenacious. I'm not particularly disciplined, but I am tenacious, and there's a difference between the two. And I kind of got very stubborn about this is what I was going to do. And I definitely had days when it kind of came to midnight, 1 a.m, and I hadn't done it yet. And I was like, no, you sit and you do it. You don't go to bed until you've done it. And I have other days where I was much better about that. So if I was disciplined, I would set a time every day and do it at 8 o'clock in the morning every day or something, and then have it out the way. But I'm not disciplined, but I'm stubborn. So I didn't really I didn't try and fall behind that much. I did have days when I did fall behind, and sometimes I had to kind of go back and do a bit of catch up, but I kind of tried not to do that. You had another question in there, and I can't remember, because I haven't answered all those questions you gave me. Was there another one?
One of the questions was just about the inspiration.
Oh, the inspiration.
You didn't
have
any...
So that's it's a really good question, because there were definitely pages where I would kind of learn the page and go, that was a little, what am I going to do? And there definitely some drawings are better than others. Like you're doing a drawing, and I also tried to do each drawing So I think the learning took about 45 minutes and the drawing took about half an hour, 45 minutes. I wasn't going to spend hours and hours on this. But often I found it was the pages that I didn't really know where I was going. I didn't really have a clear inspiration at the beginning of the drawing, that they became the drawings I loved, because they became actually the process of drawing, the process of thinking with a pen in my hand or a pencil or a brush, whatever, that actually kind of, and then I kind of thought about that bit of the text, and then another bit of the page, another bit of the page. And then as I was doing the drawing and spending that time, then things would come together and reveal itself. So often the pages, the drawings that I like the least are the ones that I had, oh, I definitely know what I'm going to draw today. And then it was like, no, well, what was the point of doing that drawing? You knew that that's what you were going to draw at the beginning. Like, there was no need to do that drawing. So I think, so the ones where I didn't have clear inspiration are the ones that actually the ones that I really loved at the end of it. So.
Yeah. Wow. So one of the images that you showed us was about depicting the transition when the Talmud discusses the judges and then the distillation of the wine.
Yeah.
We have one question about the relationship between the left and right sides of the page. Like, how did you ever depict or deal with the two halves of the page, or the left and right side of the page?
I did. And actually, I'm going to, can I share my screen again? Because then.
Of course.
Let me just pull it out. So I did, it's a really good question, because, and I'm going to just find it. I'm not going to show you how disorganized my, it is, I am looking for Nadarim. There we go. Right, now I need to share my screen. Right, so this is Nadarim. So Nadarim is, there's a vows. So, and it's vows, I kind of always it's like a little book of petty. So these are vows where somebody sort of I vow I won't get any benefit from you, or you won't benefit from me. And it comes under Seder Nashim, about the wives, because a husband can cancel the vows that his wife makes. And for this Masechet, for this tractate, I use the two halves. Here we go. I use the two halves, the two sides. So you can see the Talmud layout here on the left and the right. You can see with the dots, the one dot and then two dots, the A and B. And I use this because it's very much a kind of, it's a tractate about kind of relationships between two people, or relationship between twos. And so I had the two halves of the folio on the page, and then I use those blocks to kind of give me frames within which and here we have, they gave frames in which to structure the drawings about these kind of problematic relationships that are kind of described here in this section. This also follows, the Nadarim is followed by Nazir. So Nazir is somebody who's made a vow to become a Nazirite, that they don't have their hair cut and they don't drink wine and they shouldn't go near dead bodies. And I have an echo again with the two halves of the folio. And that was kind of how I structured these drawings. So yeah. Those are the kind of clear. So I did play with the Talmud page, and I played with the structure of that quite a bit. Right. So yeah. So that's kind of two examples where it kind of made sense to do that.
Well, another question or set of questions is about whether you mentioned the key to hell, and curiosity about if there are other places in the project where you allude to other people's artwork or other visual allusions. And then a second question, which was whether there are points in which you engage with the scholarship of Rabbi Lord Sachs, who recently passed away.
Yeah, so I was talking about, so there are kind of visual kind of, I suppose, Easter eggs, like these little tidbits. So actually today I looked at kind of like, oh, what did I do today? And actually today when I was doing Daf Yomi, it's sort of talking about spit roasting. It's sort of like how the Pesach sacrifice was cooked, and it's like the wood, the steak, and it's like talking about like if you put stuffing in it or you put another meat in it, and the kind of like the blood goes out, goes in, gets absorbed, not absorbed. And it's like a very kind of like, that's very much kind of taken from a Francis Bacon, kind of actually a photograph of Francis Bacon standing kind of beneath. And so there are those little things of a kind of sort of art that I have sort of seen and influenced by kind of consciously, and I'm sure subconsciously there's a lot more. I mean, I also developed my own visual motifs that echo. So this one here of these two heads, these two foreheads touching, this chavrutta, this learning pair, this is all, I kind of ended up using those two all over the kind of my drawing project. So, and then actually about Rabbi Sachs, my husband was actually very close to Rabbi Sachs, who was one of his Talmudim, and I was very lucky to kind of have a relationship and know him personally. And Rabbi Sachs knew that I was doing this project and was always very supportive and curious about it. And I would say that my influence on Rabbi Sachs comes really in my approach. So Rabbi Sachs was very much like this kind of, you take your Torah learning and you take the knowledge and wisdom that you have from all different sources and you bring it all together, and it can all combine, and it can all kind of, and there can be this kind of sacred conversations, and that there is, and to bring your full self to Torah, and to bring the Torah to everything you're interested in. And I took very much that, and I feel that very strongly in terms of that's how I relate with my artwork, that I kind of bring my Torah into my artwork and my art, and also when I write about kind of my work, I will kind of quote Talmud as well as kind of philosophy and other things, and art critics, and I will bring, and it's a full conversation. And I'm very much influenced by his approach in terms of what it means to be fully engaged in Torah and fully engaged in the knowledge of the world. And he is someone who I dearly miss, actually. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a really beautiful way of sort of
although we disagreed about visual culture. I had an ongoing argument with him about visual culture, but that's a whole other side.
Is that because he was more suspicious about visual culture?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't his thing. Aesthetics, I mean, he had a very beautiful ear for music and oral kind of like listening aesthetics, but, and also he did, it's not fair for me to say that but it wasn't really his thing, the kind of the visual, in the same way that his appreciation of music was. But it was, we just kind of, anyway. It's he was good to argue with, because he liked people asking questions and challenging him and pushing conversations further, and I was lucky enough to kind of have many of those with him. Hopefully it was always done with respect.
I'm sure it was, and very much actually in the spirit of studying Talmud and having discussions and debates, L'Shem Shamayim, for the sake of heaven. If it's okay with you, I want to maybe ask two more questions before we wrap up. The first is, thinking a little bit about the other people with whom you are either in dialogue or with whom you see, like, who's your community in terms of artists, like the artists from previous generations or artistic influences, and also much more about the contemporary artistic community. That, do you work alone? Do you work together? How do the people with whom you work come into this project?
So, so whilst I was doing this, when I was doing the Daf Yomi, and I was very much doing it on my own, in terms, well, I kind of was like, well, I had a Hevruta with Ralph Steinsaltz. He wrote this just for me. I was doing it on my own. It wasn't, because like Daf Yomi, you're part of a bigger conversation. There's Rabbi Avi Strasberg, who is, she wrote a haiku every day for a Daf Yomi in one breath, which is so beautiful. And we've never met, but we found out about each other's projects, and we kind of corresponded quite a few times. And actually for her CM, she kind of did this interview with me, and then for my CM, I did this interview with her over Zoom, which was like this, like it was before we were using Zoom every day. It seemed very exciting. And it was like, yes, we're really having this global conversation, her and I. We were fulfilling Rabbi Meir Shapiro's vision, although he probably wouldn't have recognized that. But so I definitely felt that I mean, that's just one example, but there are many others. But in terms of artistic influences, there's some really interesting stuff going on in terms of contemporary Jewish art at the moment. A very close friend of mine is an Israeli artist called Ken Goldman, who he talks about mitzvot as performance art. And I really strongly advise to check out his work. There's some also really interesting kind of feminist Jewish artwork out there, which there's so many different people who are kind of involved, make really interesting work. They're like Annie Arnowitz. There's, I'm now Andy. I'm now blanking on names, which is terrible. I'm now going to think of all the names after but there's also like other artists. I mean, I find the work of Edmund de Waal, who's a British contemporary artist who works primarily with ceramics, but also does really interesting stuff around texts. And he created a very beautiful installation called the Library of Exile. And I kind of find his work very poetic and very beautiful. I'm also very influenced by writers and poetry. I was kind of, and in my own, I mean, I recently finished an MA in fine art at St. Martin's, and through that I met a really interesting group of other artists within which we're kind of, at the moment we're doing this really interesting postal project where we're kind of posting each other artwork to kind of stay in touch, and also kind of keep it, to kind of help us keep going through and maintaining our artistic practice during this lockdown. And what was really exciting for me about meeting them and engaging with the kind of MA is that I was coming kind of very much from this kind of contemporary Jewish art world, stepping into kind of mainstream art world. And I was a little nervous about how my stuff would be received. And it was amazing how it was received. I mean, my tutors were so supportive. I mean, although the first time I met my personal tutor and I sort of was explaining my Daf Yomi project to her, and she was like going, oh, I don't really know anything about Talmud. And it's like, that's okay, I do. You're here to tell me about art. So and actually she was great and really supportive, really fantastic. And I had to kind of submit like a paper, a sort of thesis, sort of long, sort of 10,000 word paper at the end, and it was actually wasn't that long. It wasn't 10,000 words. It felt like it was anyway. So and I quoted like whole sections. I included kind of Talmudic stuff in it, but also kind of Deleuze, Guattari, and Derrida, and Helene Cizou, and kind of Bracha Ettinger, who's an incredible artist and philosopher and psychotherapist who's done really interesting work around Edmund Yabez and the book and traces. So I kind of like, what's been really exciting for me is that whilst it's that thing of being deeply personal and very much rooted in my engagement with this tradition, actually speaks and it crosses those kind of cultural boundaries. And there's many conversations that could be had from all different perspectives. So I've kind of found a really interesting, mixed, diverse contemporary artistic community outside of this kind of just this contemporary Jewish world, the contemporary Jewish art world, of which is also very rich and big and exciting. So yeah, and I to put into that, so there's an amazing artist in London called Sarah Lightman, who does incredible kind of very personal diary drawings, and kind of also bringing in her experience as a mother, as an artist, and her work is quite extraordinary. So, and I'm kind of quite influenced by her as well, I'd say.
That's amazing of the many people that your artwork has touched and that it engages with, and there are many people just listening right now who feel very similarly. So my last question is, what's next? What are you working on in addition? But I want to add that there were a few recommendations or questions, a few about whether you have ever illustrated or considered illustrating the Passover Haggadah, another about whether you've done or considered the Psalter. There was a question about where people can contact you. Do you sell your artwork? So that is all that there's an overflowing excitement, but also curiosity.
Thank you.
What are you doing these days?
People are very welcome to contact me. My website is jacquelinenicholls.com. And you can find my contact details there. It's also, that's my name, that's on Instagram. And you can find my email and all those contacts there. So actually I have done a Haggadah. I did a project sponsored by Bet Venetia, which is a really interesting Jewish sort of think tank space in Venice, which is sort of rethinking what it means to be Jewish in Venice. Which is it's a kind of community, it's huge challenges at the moment, and their vision was bringing kind of sort of artists of different disciplines to come and be kind of have these residences in Venice and engage with the contemporary Venice and also the Jewish heritage of Venice. So I was the sort of lead artist for the new project called the New Venice Haggadah, where there were 8 artists, and we each responded to the Haggadah in contemporary Venice. And actually that Haggadah, hopefully, I mean, it was done the artwork was done a few years ago, but hopefully the actual printed commercial available Haggadah is being brought out hopefully this year. It's had a few little setbacks, but that was exciting, and that actually leads to a kind of one of my projects that I have at the moment is that through Bet Venetia, again we are doing I'm doing a project with them on the Megillat Esther, a Venetian Megillat Esther, and I'm working with 3 other artists. All 4 of our artists are women, and it's very deliberate that. And that is looking at, and that is Mirta Kupferman, Tilla Crown, and Sophie Herxheimer and myself. And we're doing Megillat Esther, and our link to Venice is gambling. And Venice actually was the site of the first public casino. And there were lots of kind of gambling and card games and stuff. And actually thinking about the Megillah itself is a game of chance. And from the lottery, the poor of the lottery of the date that is drawn, and this idea that kind of in one night your fortunes can be won or lost, and there's lots of kind of chances and coincidences and things happening. So that's our lens in which we're doing it, and hopefully a little sneak peek about the Megillat Esther. So we're producing the Megillat Esther with our artwork, and we'll also be producing a pack of cards to go with it. And in our pack of cards, the king is obviously Achashverosh, the queen is Esther, Haman is the jack, Mordechai is your ace in the hold, and God is the joker. So that's what I'm working on. I have some other projects. I'm kind of doing a couple of other projects. I'm doing something before Pesach this year, creating a kind of series of animations, looking at using the 4 cups of wine, but taking inspiration from the kind of the spilling of the wine when mentioning the plagues, and reflecting about this moment of being in a global plague, and thinking about the way the Haggadah goes from this kind of oppression to redemption. And we're not quite at the redemption bit yet. So this kind of the shakiness as we hold our wine and wine is spilt that we're in at the moment. So that's another thing I'm working on. And I'm taking my kind of experiments of kind of handwriting as a form of drawing, the way that it falls into illegibility, and yet still calls to be read and still kind of emotionally engages with us. So I'm kind of doing some work on that as well. So yeah, and I'm going for lots of walks, probably like everybody else in pandemic, because there's nothing else to do.
Wow. Well, I am so grateful that on this afternoon and evening I could learn from you and continue to hear about your artwork. I have lots of questions myself about your Omer project, so hopefully one day I can
see one of them here. Sorry, but I see that there. That's one of my Omer projects. Anyway, yeah. Sorry.
This was I learned a lot about the Talmud, which is what I work on, and about your art, and I really want to thank you on behalf of Fordham Center for Jewish Studies, on behalf of everyone who's listening, and also to wish you a lot of luck with the exciting projects you're doing now, and also to wish you and your family and everyone listening health and a good continuation in this really challenging time. I think there's a new resonance to a project that's about counting the days and filling one's time with learning each day in a period where each day really feels like a process to go through. And I also want just to remind everybody that we have another event next week on Wednesday, and you can sign up through the registration in the chat that I sent out, or on our website or blog, or to email us. But really, I want to end tonight by saying really deep gratitude, both for the work you're doing and also for being so generous in sharing your ideas with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.